Here's a real head-scratcher from India's Supreme Court that we're digging into today. Can you settle a legal case, have everyone agree that it's all done, and still get hit with a penalty from the court? I know, it sounds like it makes no sense, but it actually happened. Let's find out how.
Just imagine this for a second. You're in some kind of financial dispute. You manage to work it all out, you reach an agreement, and the person you owed money to, they're totally happy. The case is officially settled. But then, a judge turns around and orders you to pay a penalty anyway. How on earth is that even possible? Well, let's break it down. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. Our story kicks off with a man named Rajeev Khandelwal, and his legal journey started out looking pretty standard. Nothing out of the ordinary, or so it seemed at first. So Mr. Khandelwal was convicted for a bounced check. He appealed that conviction to a higher court, but no luck. The appeal was dismissed. So his next move was to file what's called a revision petition with the high court. But here's the key part. While that was all going on, he actually worked things out with the other person. They reached a settlement, the dispute was over. And this is the point where you'd think the story ends, right? The two people who were actually in the dispute had figured it out, the complainant was satisfied, the appellant had made it right. In any normal world, that should have been it. Case closed. Well, not quite.
And this is where things get weird. This brings us to the unexpected penalty. Because just when it seemed like everything was resolved, the court threw in a major curveball, an acquittal that came with a pretty big catch.
So, on the surface, the high court did what you'd expect. It saw that the two parties had settled, and because of that, it acquitted Mr. Khandelwal. That's the good news. But it came with a very significant string attached. And there it is. The court basically said, sure, you're acquitted, but you have to pay a penalty, to a totally separate third party, the State Legal Services Authority. So get this, the money wasn't even going to the person who was owed it in the first place. This is the absolute heart of the matter. It just begs the question, if the person who is actually harmed by the bounced check is happy and has no more complaints, why is the court stepping in and demanding a penalty? Why make someone pay more money, especially to an organization that had nothing to do with the original problem? So what was the high court thinking? Well, their reasoning all comes down to this tricky distinction between a guideline and a law, and it all goes back to one specific landmark judgment that kind of set the stage for cases like this. See, the High Court was leaning on this 2010 case called Damodar S. Prabhu. Now, the original goal of that ruling was actually a good one. It was meant to encourage people to settle these bounced check cases to clear up the courts. It created this system of escalating costs. Basically, the longer you wait to settle, the higher the penalty you pay. It was an incentive to sort things out quickly. And this just lays out the central conflict perfectly. On one side, you have the High Court, which looked at that Damodar judgment as a strict rulebook. Settle late, you pay the penalty. No ifs, ands, or buts. But the appellant's lawyer said, whoa, wait a minute. That ruling was meant to be a guideline, not some rigid, unbreakable law. They argued that forcing this payment actually goes against the whole point of encouraging settlements in the first place. The appellant's arguments were really straightforward and, honestly, pretty human. First, he said the precedent was just a guideline, not an ironclad rule. Second, on a very practical level, he said he just couldn't afford to pay this extra cost. Third, and this is huge, the person he'd actually settled with was totally fine and didn't want any more money. And finally, this payment wasn't about making things right. It was basically a fee to a government authority. So you've got this standoff, a rigid interpretation of a rule on one side and the practical reality of a situation on the other. This whole conflict set the stage for the final act. The case went all the way up to the Supreme Court, which was going to have the final say. And it was here, at the highest court in the country, that this whole messy issue was going to be decided once and for all. The Supreme Court took a hard look at all the arguments, especially that Damodar S. Prabhu precedent that was causing all the trouble. And wow, this one line from their judgment says it all. The Supreme Court made it crystal clear that Damodar S. Prabhu case cannot be treated as a binding, one-size-fits-all rule. They drove home a core principle of justice. You have to look at the unique facts of every single case. The court's thinking here was just incredibly pragmatic. They looked at what was actually happening on the ground. First, the complainant was satisfied. End of story. Second, the appellant genuinely couldn't pay the extra penalty. And third, these specific human details of the case were more important than just mechanically applying some old guideline. So the penalty was thrown out. This ruling is about so much more than just one bounce check. It really shines a light on this fundamental tension you see in any legal system, the clash between following precedent and focusing on the people involved. It's about finding that balance between being consistent and doing what's actually just in a specific situation.
What this Supreme Court decision really drives home is that justice can't just be some rigid, automated system. Yeah, legal guidelines and precedents are super important for consistency, but at the end of the day, they have to serve justice, not get in its way. The system has to be flexible enough to deal with the real world and the actual lives of the people involved. And that leaves us with this final, really important question to chew on. As we try to build a fair and consistent legal system, where do you draw that line? When does a helpful guideline turn into an unbreakable rule? And when should the unique details of a person's story allow for some flexibility? There's no easy answer, and it's definitely something worth thinking about. Thanks for tuning in.